Good afternoon. Welcome to Oilfield Strong. My name is Grant Swartzwelder, President of OTA Environmental Solutions. Today, we're lucky to have a fantastic speaker that is no stranger to the Permian Basin and PBPA. His name's Chris Kearney. He's been for the last, 5-10 years, a senior advisor to PBPA on federal issues. And so it's in that regard that we're lucky to have him come and talk, because as we all know, there's a lot going on out there with Subpart W, methane tax, SEC issues, and they've been hanging around out there for a while. But with COP coming up, as we've seen in the past, that's when they love to make their announcements so they can show that America is being really green. So I think the timeliness of this presentation, Chris, is fantastic, and really look forward to your comments on these federal issues and how it's going to affect the oil industry, and especially the Permian, but really the industry as a whole, because they are federal. So with that, there's kind of a roadmap in a way. You've got Subpart W and the methane tax, and then you've got SEC. I know there's some other environmental related issues with the ESA that you want to go over. But let me just kind of let you start off and kind of give us a roadmap of how this all fits together, because it's all very integrated.
Sure. Thanks, Grant. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm coming up on, it's here before too long. It'll be 5 years as a federal advisor to PBPA, and I've enjoyed that time enormously. Ben Shepard and his team are some of the best in the business that I've ever had the opportunity to work with, and grateful to continue to have that opportunity. And we are, with PBPA and across the industry, really focusing on a handful of things. And what I thought I would do is just sort of step back for a minute and a half or so to kind of give you some context before we delve into some of these individual items. So from the start of this administration, I've been in Washington for better than 35 years now, and I've had the opportunity to either serve or work in the legislative and policy arena across 7 different administrations. And going back to the second Reagan administration, when I first came to town, to give you some idea of what my arc has been. And I've been lucky enough to work in the executive branch, as well as in the Senate and in the House. And so I've seen a whole series of the different machinations and the evolution of the power of the executive branch as things have gotten a little bit more and more dysfunctional. And people have sought to find different leverage ways to sort of influence and advance their objectives. And I can say, really without fear of contradiction, as somebody who really understands, I think, deeply how the executive branch process works, I have never seen an administration that from day one came so prepared to utilize the levers and powers of government to advance their agenda. They have especially when it comes to taking out the oil and gas industry and replacing it with this sort of utopian kind of decarbonized clean energy economy, which of course we all want, but it's obviously in a much more nuanced and patterned way and perhaps more complex way than the administration has, I think, sought to portray it. They, for example, on day one of their administration, actually while they were still in their transition period, produced a climate change plan, roadmap, manifesto, whatever you want to call it, for every single department and major agency. Unheard of. The notion that the SEC, and it's an important context because the notion that the SEC would be asking public companies potentially to provide the climate change emissions for their companies through a financial filing, when as a practical matter, that's EPA's job and EPA's role, comes out of that climate change plan that the SEC developed. The rulemakings you've seen out of the Department of Interior for our friends in Southeast New Mexico, people in New Mexico are very familiar with sort of the onslaught of executive orders and steps on public lands that the administration took early on. The leasing and bonding rule that just had comments closing a couple of days ago as an example, and the list goes on. So the Department of Energy and Climate, and HUD. And so that's an important table setter to appreciate why you seem to see kind of these different pieces moving. Let me just take the SEC piece first, because I think it's the easiest to sort of, dispense with, if you will. In a pretty substantial step, the state of California this week, Governor Newsom signed a law mandating a kind of a state level equivalent of what SEC is proposing with respect to public companies chartered in California for reporting these emissions. That sort of set off a fresh round of kind of trade press and whisper and talk about where the SEC was, because the SEC rule that would propose to do that, the comment period on that closed, I think, 12, 14, 16 months ago. Don't hold me to that, but it has been a very long time, and it was in no small measure to the kind of reaction that they got, the negative reaction that they got to that. And there are now even rumors that every day that goes by that the SEC might ultimately drop that from that process. They haven't yet, but every day that goes by, you wonder about that. So that's the context in which we deal every day in Washington, and folks, within the sound of my voice, and certainly the folks at PBPA are sort of battling on an ongoing basis, not to mention all the state level work that's happening. So on the issue of methane, that you need to appreciate that this administration and their allies from the very start realized two things. One, that large major integrated oil companies under the umbrella of the American, the API, the American Petroleum Institute, those entities took the issue of methane and combat with the administration off the table right away. Within the first week, API declared that they supported direct federal regulation for methane emissions of existing and new operations. So in the first week, Big Oil got in front of it and took it off the table in terms of something the administration could focus on. That didn't change the administration's rhetoric, but it led them to pivot pretty quickly to, they needed a new boogeyman, frankly. And so on a political level, they turned to small and medium-sized producers and independent producers, and they have, if you see, and that was sort of their political tack. They pivoted to the middle of the operations, the heart, the mom and pop, sort of the backbone of the people that make this country great, and all of the service worker companies like yours and others that are associated with that. Substantively, they chose the notion of methane from a very early start because they could sensationalize it, they could highlight it, and let's be honest, methane is a real issue. We have other sectors besides oil and gas that actually produce more methane in these United States than just us, but that was not convenient for them. So that's another sort of element of the politics of this.
Yep.
But nonetheless, where we are today is that this administration has made methane regulation a centerpiece of what they're trying to do substantively and politically, and it fits it checks a lot of boxes. The things we have to be the most concerned about are that EPA is on two tracks. They appear to be separate, but they are closely linked and integrated, and they're very problematic for a reason. And I'm going to stay out of the weeds as much as I can. If I wander there, pull me back.
Oh, that's great. This is helpful.
The first track is the one we're likely to see a shoe drop on here, as you indicated, with the looming meeting of the parties, COP, the 20, scheduled for the end of November. This is an international, under the umbrella of the UN, going back to the mid-1990s under the Clinton administration. There was a gathering of all major industrialized countries who were united in an aspirational goal of hitting certain climate change targets and greenhouse gas reductions. The first COP, Committee of the Parties, Commission of the Parties, I forget exactly what it stands for, but that's what it's, Committee of the Parties. So they have met roughly every 2 years in this I wouldn't say elusive, but in this ever continuous effort to try to capture members of light of climate change, setting aside the reality of Russia and China and India by and large not being part of those conversations. So here we find ourselves 30 plus years, 30 odd years later, we're still chasing these sort of elusive efforts. Every sort of Democratic administration tries to come to one of these with some marquee effort that they're doing on climate. This year, the methane has been the buzzword in all of those conversations. It will be again. We anticipate what the administration will try to do is come to those meetings with a newly announced final rule, which is essentially for us really important. It's a rulemaking that's been under development in various forms, literally since the administration started, perhaps even in their transition period. And it has a very technical name, but it is very simply a testing and inspection rulemaking that will require, it will have a performance standard set that will require everyone who's in the business, who has any kind of operation, from a barrel a day as a stripper well operator to 200 barrels a day or hundreds of barrels a day, whatever your operation is, you will be required to test and inspect your equipment for methane emissions. not only just fugitive, but elements that could be coming out of gathering and boosting lines, that could be coming out of your tank battery. Literally no place where they won't pursue that. The good news, if there is such a thing, is that there is a series of steps that the states have to take, which could buy us as much as almost 5 years before that rulemaking, for a variety of reasons, is actually filed in your state. Every state has 18 months to produce a plan. Then they have to do what's shorthand known as a SIP, or state implementation plan. They have up to 36 months to each of them to do that. I don't think it's unrealistic to believe, however, that EPA might use some of their own authority to undercut what's supposed to be a state primacy issue in the context of these clean air issues, or these clean air law provisions. That said, we'll still have to be prepared for it, whether it's several months down the road or not, because different states will move at different paces. So that's the primary track. That's the one everybody thinks about when they hear about the methane rule or methane rules. It's the so-called referred to as Quad O-B and Quad O-C, which refers to the regulatory element and the subset of the law. But think of it as a testing and inspection standard that you're going to have to meet, a performance standard that you're going to have to meet, set by your states, but no one is exempt, at least based on what we've seen so far. And yes, I know I can hear folks saying, but I'm so small, I don't give off emissions, or my equipment is sealed and I never have anything. Well, that is more likely than not, but there probably is going to be a process where you're going to have to even show that. So that's
but on something like that, there's still a lot of rules that people are going to follow, but there's really not a lot of enforcement. So if the tree falls and no one knows it, then do they have to do anything?
They'll be heavy enforcement. That one, there'll be heavy enforcement because it'll be the states. The states will be the enforcers. In fact, states like Texas right now and Oklahoma, they're putting drones up in the air and they're flying over operations right now. EPA is flying drones in Texas. They issued, or I guess they didn't issue, but there was some press about the fact that in places like Texas and Oklahoma, EPA is actually talking about flying their own drones and making noises about, using that data in this or other means. So,
well, that's EPA and Environmental Defense Fund, those environmental that are doing it. It's really not the Railroad Commission, TCQ,
right,
in Texas. New Mexico, well, even in New Mexico, I think it's EPA and environmental that are flying the drones and reporting and doing.
But it could be. But my point being that you're right. But it could be that's where the pressure comes. But the states are going to be the ones that are going to be expected now. Yeah. But you make a really, really important point, and I think having worked in federal service, I think I can guess the way out of this. You could envision a situation where the feds know that there's just so many operators, there's so many small little guys that even the states couldn't possibly realistically, be out there, doing the actual enforcement. So what they'll do is they'll require you to do the inspection. They'll require you to do documentation. Maybe you fill out a form and you email it to the state, you upload it, whatever. And then you create a paper record and a paper trail that the state audits by spot inspection. And that's one of the areas I'm very concerned about because, PBPA certainly has plenty of small operators and stripper well operators, as does everyone. Well, those guys are, we're talking about maybe 1 to 5 to 7 barrels a day. We're talking about, 3 to 5 to 6 employees. Yep. Community banking being what you're backing. This is your family, this is your family business that's been in the family forever. This could be just the kind of thing where you say the heck with it, because they put a paperwork responsibility on you that you either don't do or you don't think is worth it or whatever, and then you worry about the consequences down the line. So I anticipate this as and I want to be wrong about this, but I anticipate this as an EPA that because they've set their sights on the smaller operators, like I talked about, and because EDF and others are running around talking about the fact that literally they have said the methane emissions in this country are disproportionately generated by the small guys. They're actually making the argument that it's not this disparate small group that you think it is. It's actually consolidated when you add it all up. The small guys are the bad guys. That's literally the arguments that they're trying to make. Yep. And so if you follow that, you could easily see a circumstance where EPA will say, you know what, if you're so small that you don't, produce, you shouldn't have any problem producing paperwork to prove it. So I don't anticipate that anybody is going to be free of this, and that's how they'll get you. That's how they'll get you on the inspection. So that's coming, period, full stop. But we probably have some time to get ready for that. So quickly moving to the things that are scarier and you may not have time for. In August of 2022, the president signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which we've all heard so much about. Embedded in that was a very bizarrely, poorly crafted, poorly put together, relatively poorly thought out, and limited in language scope, a methane emissions program. MERP, I think they're calling it, as the acronym, but the core of it is a charge or a tax on CO2 emissions that exceed 25,000 metric tons equivalents on an annualized basis across basins.
Yes.
Across basins. $900 for the first year, going up to $1,250 and on up to $1,500. The scary part about that one is on the books in law, the data collection by everybody, I'm guessing, not just somebody who's got that sort of stationary source emission, but virtually everybody will have to start collecting data in 2024, with EPA evaluating that data and issuing the charges in 2025. So by law, everybody should assume that if you know that you produce that kind of CO2 converting to methane, since this is a methane charge, think of this, it's a methane charge. That's what the law says, but they're using 25,000 metric tons of CO2. We can get into why that is. There's a very specific reason, because they took some existing reporting requirements that are currently on the books on a voluntary basis, and they've shoehorned it into a methane tax. So the author, Senator Manchin, who is one of the key authors of this, it is his view, even though it's not unfortunately in writing yet, it is his view that if you were not reporting to EPA on that CO2 emissions, you on the day of enactment in the summer of 2022, you should not be responsible. That sounds good, but here's the problem. A second regulation. So, but before I get to that, so the problem is twofold on that. That's what he hoped, that's his intent. But two things that are involved that fall into the shoe dropping category. The first is there's going to be a whole set of regulations coming at the end of probably end of this year, or first quarter of next year, governing how that tax is going to be implemented. We hope how the conversion from CO2 to methane, so we know what we're measuring, is laid out. Hopefully some clear guidance on definitions of who's exempt and who's not, some exemption thresholds, because the law would lead you to believe that if you're somebody who's listening to me who says, well, I do, 40 MCF of gas a day across my operations, just to pick a number, of course I won't be responsible, or won't have to report. Well, you could again see a situation where, unless the regulation exempts you, where you might have to produce a document to show that you are exempt. You could easily envision that situation. So we have that shoe to drop. We have another shoe that's starting to already drop, which is as part of that law, before they fully implemented, the law said you, EPA, need to update and modernize the process by which people are going to collect the data. Yep. That is going to be part of the tax reporting. So even though it's not officially formally part of the regs associated with the tax, it is a critical piece of the guidelines for the reporting and the procedures that you're going to have to do. And here's why it's so important. That in the course of doing that rulemaking dramatically expands what kind of equipment has to be inspected and what kind of activities have to be inspected as part of the reporting requirement to see whether you meet the 25,000 metric tons. Why? Because that rulemaking, so-called Subpart W, which just refers to the regulatory provision that this reporting comes from, includes, by reference, the testing and inspection rule. So what you do in Quad O, B, and C, the testing inspection rule, your reporting there will feed into the reporting requirements of Subpart W rulemaking, which in turn will be the basis for whether the tax is assessed through the IRA. So what they've done is they've taken one rulemaking that was over here as testing inspection that was originally by itself, and they now wrap that and another test reporting requirement together, which by definition is going to expand the amount of data and the type of reporting that rolls into the 25,000 metric tons. And so that's what we're facing potentially. That's what we're dealing with right now. That's one of the things we're spending a lot of time in Washington trying to get a spotlight on that, trying to, have had filed comments, rallying the troops for members, seeing about states that could potentially engage in lawsuits and that sort of thing. So it's a very it's a cause for significant concern, because the way the different piecemeal is floating around, it never comes together in any media kind of way. And yet from EPA's point of view, they're very effectively stitching those things together. So certainly folks at PBPA are focused on this, and I know a lot of other folks are as well.
So let's talk about that. So if I understand, 25,000 ton is the cutoff, that below which you don't have to report, but they're changing the rules and the empirical data, or the assumptions, if you will, that could make someone that is 20,000 all of a sudden be above 25,000.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like there's several areas, like how they handle flare and destruction efficiencies, some of the compression and what's going on with the methane leak associated with compression, and kind of various things that they're requiring. Plus, they're just arbitrarily changing the values that they use in their
the emission
calculation.
factor. That's right. Great point. They are emissions factors. Excuse me. Modified emissions factors are going to be also part of that calculation, and they've altered that, and that's a huge element to this, that the emission factors are going to complain. The other thing they did was the law, and this is to Manchin's credit, the law, the IRA, the methane tax, and this is why I think we may have some legal leverage here for a variety of reasons, but the law says you at EPA have been collecting minimal empirical data since 2012, when you first established this voluntary reporting requirement for the 25 metric tons for stationary sources. It's been a voluntary process. EPA has used a lot of modeling and projections to extrapolate what data they've gotten to draw conclusions about those emissions across these stationary sources. So as part of the law says, hey, we know that's what you've been doing. So time out under subpart W, and presumably by extension, the testing inspection, we need empirical data. We need you to get from people actual data that is emitting from their operations. I interpret the rule, as do others, although the language is so bureaucratic.
Yep.
Yeah, we absolutely believe that they have completely ignored that, barred people from submitting data as relevant, and continuing to use modeling. Now, I'm a little skeptical that that's the way the language will sort of ultimately shake out. But the initial read of the subpart W rules are that they've disregarded the requirement for empirical data over modeling projections in terms of the tax and that sort of thing.
And even if they provided the data, we have a company called ESG Dynamics that have scraped all this data and done a lot of trend analysis. A lot of bad data out there.
Yeah.
A lot of bad, and some of that's on the company not consistently putting that data in, but some of it is just fat fingering from the regulatory groups and others. And we're amazed by the lack of consistency and accuracy of that data that they're using. But then the other thing, we've kind of, for that data, what I've heard, and maybe it's urban myth, that a lot of those values that they're using to kind of bump that 25,000 amount up, or above that 25,000,
right,
is coming really not from testing out in the field, but really from environmental advocacy groups, formulaic type things like you're describing. So that really, I question whether it really has validity or tied to reality. Is that
well? Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm. Correct me if I'm completely.
Yeah, no, I think that's the concern. And then they're one of the big questions is they're establishing a super emitter program that early on in the initial rulemaking for testing inspection rule. and I think this is in the law too, but in the early versions of the testing inspection rule, they had this ungodly, unwielding, wide open, third party citizen oriented like super emitter deal where you could, stand at the gate, right, of a PBPA member and point your little gun and collect data for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever, and then go report it and have them declared a super emitter, or have somebody fly over in the EDF plane, like the CNN guys were helpful enough to show last Christmas. They did this extended 8-minute piece, and it was CNN riding along with the EDF guys. So that, I'm a little amazed by what EPA did there, but that to say it freaked people out was, to put it mildly. And people made the point, are you going to allow individuals to walk onto private property so there's a trespassing question, but even more importantly than that, this is complex, potentially dangerous equipment and vapors and things for people to be around. So what happens if they come in there and start snooping around and doing testing and get hurt and something happens and all that? So they changed it to a super emitter program, a so-called massive flaring. But what I don't believe they've defined yet, and this is a cause for a lot of concern, is how do you define super emitter? Constant flaring for 24 hours, pointing a gun for 5 minutes and extrapolating 24 hours, those kinds of things. So that how they handle super emitter for purposes of, and how the states to some extent, get guidance to do it, is a remaining lingering question. One of the things to remember about federal regulations, particularly as it relates to EPA in this space, while the states quote unquote walk in the shoes of the feds, they implement the regulations, they have their own implementation plans, they have some leniency. The federal regulation is the floor. So no state, if there's an emission standard, can go below that. So whatever the super emitter thresholds are, to the extent to which EPA spells them out, is a real issue. I do want to get to the ESA stuff if you want, but I'm happy to talk a little bit more about.
Well, just one question about the super emitter to make sure. So is that just more of the mechanics? So will they come up with terms and designate your flare or your emission as a super emitter? Or is it the other way where someone is like a Environmental Defense Fund is using a flare camera, identifying it, and then it goes and then it becomes.
I don't think we know. I don't think we know. The language I have not looked at in a few months, so I'm a little bit fuzzy. But
it keeps changing, so it's
right. Well, I think the short answer is that the intention. This is an indisputable fact. The Environmental Defense Fund is working extremely closely with EPA and with their allies in Congress. There are critical elements of the testing and inspection rule that come directly from Colorado, elements of Colorado's, and I think to a lesser extent, New Mexico. In fact, I asked a career person at EPA when they had a public hearing on the first iteration of the testing and inspection rule, which was set based on tons of emission of methane, curiously. Anyway, so I was asking her, well, where does your framework come from? What are you basing this on? And in an open forum, she said the Colorado methane emissions program. And lo and behold, that's
not surprising.
Yeah, not just surprising they admitted it. There are former EDF staffers at EPA. There are former EDFs, longtime Senator Michael Bennett from Colorado, his natural resources and energy staffer, his chief energy advisor, was, at least for a 2 to 3 year period, I think she's still there, she had been 14 years at EDF. And Senator Bennett led a letter to EPA outlining what they consider to be acceptable basics, including a super emitter program, in the rulemaking. And it was signed by all the Democrats from Colorado. Michael Bennett led the letter. The letter was footnoted in every way except the provision related to small producers. I find out that the staffer, she's a wonderful person, I like her a lot, she had penned the letter. She had led the letter. And this is somebody who worked 14 years at EDF. So I say that because if you want to have a sense of where EPA is likely to go in a lot of these final, rulemakings and requirements, look at EDF's website, look at what EVF is all about in terms of their
Sure.
focus. So that's, I think, in terms of super emitters, there is no question that EDF's view is that the average citizen should be able to have, a flare camera, or should be able to have an equipment. They should be able to sit there, point at the emissions, take that data, give it to EPA, and it should be valid and be used. That's EPA's that's EDF's basic approach, that you should use the data and be able to use the data of folks who just happen to, point something at them for 15 minutes or so. How does that all translate out into the ultimate actual regulation? It's yet to be clear, but it could be, obviously, in certain places, the shorter period of time that they require the data collection, and the broader the scope of the nature of the non-federal entity that they allow that data to be valid from, that's where I think there's a deep concern about another shoe dropping.
Well, and we visited with on the show, a New Mexico environmental senior person, and they basically said they will take from any valid source, and that includes individuals with cameras. So that is already happening in New Mexico. And so it's so that what you're saying is not a jump, it's kind of reality. So yes, I know you definitely got some words on the ESA and kind of what's happening, especially PBPA has been very involved in that. So yeah, please speak to that before we close up.
So PBPA, particularly led by Ben Shepherd, the president himself, have been, going back to 2012 at least, have been very deeply involved in beating back first the Obama administration and now the Biden administration's efforts to get the lesser prairie chicken listed as endangered. One of the things that does, of course, is if you get it listed as endangered, or even as threatened, one of the most immediate effects of that is it gives the federal government the authority, depending on whether it's public land or federal land, to either designate what's known as critical habitat and public land, which essentially gives them the power to gate off essentially areas for development and such. And then in private land, you have what's known as an incidental take permit, where they effectively control the same sort of thing, only more in an insidious way, because that literally limits you on how many of that species you can essentially, inadvertently do harm to, incidentally, in the course of your activities. And so PBPA has been working on this. They were incredibly successful as leaders on the litigation and other political pressure under the Obama administration. They prevailed, got the listing overturned. Out of that came a partnership-based conservation partnership effort, range-wide plan, of which PBPA, the states, Fish and Wildlife Service, just a whole host of folks were working perfectly well for a decade, up until about a year and a half ago, where in fact, except for 1 year in the last 10, maybe if you want to throw in a COVID year, maybe 8, call it 2 out of the last 11 years, the population was growing every year of lesser prairie chicken. In fact, is largely, on some parts of the range, literally doubled since 2014. That's raw data. That's survey data. That's out there. That's not, it'd be cool to have happen. The Fish and Wildlife Service folks, largely driven by career folks that the Biden administration acquiesced to and the Trump administration actively beat back, were able to bring a listing once again in one of the weakest, and I've been dealing with regulatory, environmental, and natural resource listings from inside and outside the government for 25 years. I have really never seen a proposed list, or now, essentially final listing, just so scientifically weak. Just take yourself out of the sort of the political realm of this. The PBPA put together a 90-page set of comments, 90-page set of comments that took apart the listing. Factual, scientific. And so that's where we stand on that. We're working to raise the profile of folks on the Hill about it. We've shared the comments repeatedly with folks. We're presumably litigation. I don't want to speak for them because I don't really know what's going on with that. But one has to assume that somebody's got to give litigation serious consideration on this. So that's more to come. And then, not to be outdone, is the Dune Sagebrush Lizard DSL, which I first dealt with when I was at the an electric utility, XL Energy, that had a presence in New Mexico. So I worked on it in 2014. The challenging thing with the lizard, of course, is their habitat is sand. Sand blows, their habitat moves. So it's quite a challenge. We're in the middle of a fight on that, where they've got a proposed listing. PBPA again has led the way with filing comments on that. We're going to continue to lean into that. It's I raise it because not only because, you know, as I'm as proud to be associated with PBPA in general, but the leadership that they've demonstrated on this and continue to, and have the, you know, the dog with the bone, which has allowed this pressure to continue, and the relationships that they have. But it is another example of this unrelenting whole of government approach to you know, shut down oil and gas, because frankly in some areas there's just not a lot of oil and gas operation potentially there is in some areas, but they still went after all of this. And so when you look at, you know, you look at SEC effort, you look at the methane rules, you look at ESA, you look at some of the things that are also happening on public lands that don't get a lot of attention, on leasing and bonding rules, and on water disposal, a couple of international rules. You know, elections have consequences. So folks need to make sure that no matter how busy well, I would say two things about the election. No matter how busy you are, make sure you vote next time around, regardless of what you're doing. Make sure you vote, and do not assume your friends are going to get reelected. Do not assume, if you're in a place like Texas, for example, or Oklahoma, just don't assume anything in this political environment. As somebody who spent 14 years on Capitol Hill, I've seen quite a bit, and you know, our friends are our friends, and they're awesome bipartisanly in both chambers. Frankly, we have friends on both sides of the aisle in both chambers. But we need to keep them there and continue to build. We have with the speaker now, and with Mr. Scalise as number 2, they're Louisianans. They get energy policy in an aggressive way, admittedly, and I tease my Louisiana friends about this. You know, they're kind of onshore, offshore guys, so we got to kind of educate them a little bit about onshore and upstream and that sort of thing. But we have, out of all of this kind of chaos, for lack of a better term, that we had coming out of the House out of the last few weeks, you know, we actually, from an industry perspective, have some pretty strong friends, not only there, but obviously through the committees and friends in different states. So there's a lot to work on, a lot to be vigilant on, that we'll need some help on. And one last thing I might point out real quick is, as you think about these methane rules, and you think about the different associations you're part of and the different government affairs people you have, I can tell you nothing will be more powerful to our friends in the public arena, in the Congress and elsewhere. Examples and stories that you can think of where you're already proactive on methane, because you didn't just wake up today and decide that methane was a problem, unlike some folks in Washington who think you did. You take pride in your work every day. I know that, you know that. So examples of proactive things you're already doing on methane could be very helpful as you learn more about these rules. Potential outsized impacts that don't match, you know, the punishment doesn't match the crime, sort of thing. You know, examples of potential cost, not just cost, but lack of rate of return, you know, for what they're asking. So sorry, it's sort of a general.
No, I think that's a great point, because it's a bigger thing that I've been pushing, that the industry does a terrible job of promoting all the good things that it does. And for example, we do a lot of LDAR, using a FLIR camera, an OTI camera, and we're doing a study for anonymously for one of our customers' data that shows the significant decline in leaks and therefore methane because of what they're doing. Exactly. And so, yes, that came from regulation, but because they're emphasizing it, it's having a major effect on their performance from an emissions and economic. But if no one knows about it, then we're just a bad industry.
I can think of one company that once a week, and it's obviously a larger size company, but this is something that came up in a forum at a conference that just blew me away. This company has about 1,000 miles of pipeline. They run drones checking for methane leaks up that 1,000 miles, or whatever the number is. I think it's 1,000 miles. Big. Once every week, approximately. They then dispatch crews based on that data to that specific spot to fix that methane leak, because obviously the more methane, the more you degrade the quality of the natural gas, the less economically valuable it is. That's sort of a fundamental. But this is a company that is well respected and well known that just happened to mention it offhand at a conference. And I'm like, that needs to be on the splash page of your website. And so when the point is, we've had the Clean Air Act in place for 50 years. We've had an inspection environmental regime in the states for basically that long. We're accustomed in a regulated environment and a regulated industry to go out there and do what we're supposed to be doing, with always the inevitable bad actors on either end. That's every industry. But in the main, we didn't just wake up in 2021 and decide it'd be cool to deal with methane. And I think the more that we can share that, the better. So sorry,
I think that the world we're in is a social media soundbite, and we're not playing that game, and we're in a disadvantage. So Chris, thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. Always enjoy talking to you. So thank you for your time, and you're welcome back anytime. But thank you for what you do for PBPA and for the industry as a whole.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Grant. I really appreciate it.